After my grandmother died in a house fire that investigators ruled accidental, her estate lawyer pulled me aside at the funeral reception and told me something that turned my stomach to ice. I was the sole beneficiary of her entire Vineyard estate, worth just under $90 million. My family demanded I sign it over the same week, and when I refused, they showed up 4 days later with a moving crew and an off-duty sheriff's deputy to throw me out of the only home I had left. But they stopped cold in the doorway when they saw exactly who was standing behind me. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 34 years old. I work as a forensic appraiser for insurance fraud cases up in Sonoma County. If you've ever had someone in your own family treat your grief like an opportunity, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you want to see exactly how I buried them with one phone call, stay until the end. My grandmother Constance had been gone exactly 5 days when my older brother kicked open the front door of the Vineyard house without knocking. I was sitting in her study, still in the black dress from the funeral, holding the cracked pocket compass that was the only thing they'd recovered from the burned wing of the house. My brother, whose name was Holden, stormed in trailing my younger sister Penelope and her husband Marcus, a corporate attorney out of San Francisco with a Patek Philippe watch and a smile built for closing deals. None of them were wearing black anymore. They'd shed their mourning clothes like a costume the seconds that the service ended. Holden walked straight up to my chair and snatched the compass out of my hand, letting it clatter onto the hardwood floor. "Squatting season is over, Eleanor," he said, his face flushed with that particular kind of anger men get when they think they're owed something. "Pack your things tonight." I already called a crew. Before I could even bend down to retrieve the compass, Marcus stepped forward and dropped a leather folder onto the coffee table, hard enough to crack the glass underneath. "Let me simplify this for you, since contracts were never really your strength," he said, adjusting his watch. "This is an emergency possession order approved by a county judge this morning. Holden's been named interim executor of the Whitfield Vineyards Trust. This property is now collateral for a corporate refinancing loan. You have no board seat. You have no legal standing here." I stared at the red county stamp on the paperwork. As a forensic appraiser, my entire career is built on noticing the things people hope you won't. And the thing I noticed immediately was this: nobody gets an emergency possession order from a county judge 5 days after a funeral. That kind of paperwork takes months to draft, file, and push through. This had been prepared long before my grandmother's smoke detector ever failed to go off. Penelope crossed her arms and looked me up and down with open disgust. "God, you really are still wearing that dress," she said. "You don't belong in this house, Eleanor. You never did. Mom and Dad let you waste 4 years getting an appraisal license while Holden was building an actual portfolio. You're the inventory girl. Grandma's not walking through that door to save you this time." I said nothing. The truth was, my family had stopped funding anything in my life the moment I refused to go work at Marcus's firm doing intake. I'd put myself through certification working weekends at an auction house while they wired Holden $2 million to start a hedge fund that lost half of it in 18 months. My silence only made Holden angrier. He kicked the broken glass off the coffee table and screamed that I had zero claim to a $90 million estate, that I was going to sign the handover agreement tonight, or he'd have me dragged out by the deputy waiting in his truck. That's when my mother, Diane, finally appeared in the doorway, dabbing at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She'd been waiting in the hall, letting the men play enforcer before she swept in to perform grief. "Eleanor, sweetheart, please listen to your brother," she said, sitting beside me on the leather sofa and taking my hand like it was something fragile. "You've always been so stubborn. Holden is in serious trouble in New York. If we don't liquidate this property fast, we lose everything. The club, the house in Napa, all of it. Be a good daughter. Sacrifice for your brother." I looked down at her manicured hand wrapped around mine, and something inside me that had been holding on for 34 years finally let go. She wasn't grieving her own mother, the woman who'd raised half of this family practically by herself. She was grieving her social calendar. To her, I had always been collateral, something to be cashed in the moment her golden son made a mistake. I pulled my hand away. While my mother tried to recompose herself, I caught Holden and Marcus drifting toward the bay window, thinking they were far enough away to speak privately. They weren't. The vaulted ceilings of that old farmhouse carried every word straight to me. "We need her signature today," Marcus hissed. "The Cayman accounts are dry, Holden. If we can't show 15 million in collateral by Friday, the SEC opens a formal inquiry into the Whitfield Capital Fund. I know, Holden whispered back, pacing like a trapped animal. But we're 40 million short. If this property doesn't clear escrow, we're not looking at bankruptcy. We're looking at wire fraud charges. I sat perfectly still, absorbing every word. This was never about a struggling business or sibling rivalry. Holden and Marcus had been embezzling from the family trust for years, and the federal government was already circling. My grandmother's vineyard was their last lifeline, and they needed to steal it from me to cover up a crime. Eleanor, are you even listening to me? My mother snapped, her sweetness gone. Sign the paper. I stood up slowly. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I walked to the stone fireplace, picked up the emergency possession order off the table, and dropped it into the flames. The room went dead silent except for the crackle of paper turning to ash. Have you lost your mind? Holden lunged forward, and Marcus grabbed his arm to hold him back. You think burning a piece of paper stops me? I have the sheriff on speed dial. Tomorrow morning, you're getting dragged off this property in front of the moving crew, and I'm going to enjoy every second of it. I'm not going anywhere, I said, my voice steady. This house is mine. And if I were you, I'd worry less about throwing me out and more about what happens to you when the sun comes up tomorrow. I walked past all four of them and went upstairs. They had no idea I was the only grandchild who knew about the hidden safe behind the wine racks in the cellar. They had no idea what my grandmother had left waiting for me down there. I waited until the house went completely silent, until I heard Marcus's car tires screech down the gravel driveway around 1 in the morning. Then I changed into work clothes and went down to the cellar. My grandmother had built that wine cellar herself 30 years ago, and behind a specific rack of 1998 Cabernet, there was a mechanism only I knew about. She'd shown me once when I was 16, swearing me to secrecy, saying I was the only one in the family who'd never once asked her for money. The rack swung open onto a steel panel with a biometric scanner. My eye and thumbprint unlocked it in seconds. Inside, there was no cash, no jewelry. There was a leather folder stamped Village 1987 and an encrypted hard drive. My grandmother had always said real power wasn't money, it was information. I plugged the drive into my laptop in her study. The password prompt came up, and I typed in the serial number off the compass Holden had thrown to the floor. The files opened. The first folder, labeled Audit, contained 2 years of private forensic accounting my grandmother had quietly commissioned. Holden and Marcus had set up 4 shell companies registered in Delaware, forging her signature on corporate loan documents, funneling money out of the family trust into a hedge fund that had collapsed spectacularly. They were $40 million underwater, and the SEC was closing in. The Vineyard was the only asset large enough to plug the hole before the quarterly audit. Then I opened the last folder. It was labeled with the tail number of a small Cessna, the same plane that had supposedly malfunctioned the night the smoke detectors in the East Wing failed and my grandmother never made it out. My hands went cold. Inside was a single wire transfer receipt, $200,000 sent from one of Marcus's shell companies to a private contractor dated 4 days before the fire, with a memo line that simply read Inspection Services. I recognized the contractor's name. He did fire alarm system maintenance for half the estates in the valley. They hadn't just stolen from my grandmother. They had disabled her smoke detectors and let her burn to death in her own home so they wouldn't have to wait for nature to take its course. I don't remember how long I sat there. I remember the nausea, and then I remember the rage replacing it, cold and total. My mother had asked me to sacrifice for the son who had ordered the death of her own mother. I picked up the leather folder again and found a thick cardstock envelope with a 10-digit number embossed in silver and a note in my grandmother's handwriting. Use this when the wolves come for the door. I called it. A man answered on the first ring asking for a clearance code. Whitfield Trust, priority access, Eleanor, I said. There was a pause, then typing, then his voice changed entirely. Mrs. Whitfield, your grandmother told us this call might come. We've had the Whitfield Capital accounts flagged for 18 months waiting for them to make a fatal mistake. Tell me they made it. They did better than that, I said. They're sending a moving crew and an off-duty deputy to forcibly remove me from a federally significant witness property at 9 tomorrow morning. By 6 in the morning, agents had quietly taken positions along the tree line of the property. I stood at the kitchen window in a charcoal suit, pouring coffee into my grandmother's chipped mug, watching the convoy come up the driveway, 2 black SUVs and a moving truck tore across the lawn my grandmother had tended for 40 years, crushing the lavender beds without a thought. Marcus got out first, briefcase in hand. Holden followed, sweating despite the cool morning. Penelope strutted out with an iced coffee, filming for her followers. My mother stepped out last in oversized sunglasses and a fur coat, ready to play the triumphant matriarch. 4 men in tactical gear climbed out of the second SUV. Holden hadn't hired movers, he'd hired muscle. Drag her Holden barked at the lead man. I don't care if she's screaming. Relax, Marcus said, waving the fraudulent order in the air. We're doing this by the book. Her grace period's over. I opened the front door before they reached it and stepped onto the porch with my coffee, taking a slow sip. The lead guard froze. He was used to dealing with people who panicked. He wasn't prepared for a woman who looked like she already knew how this ended. I'd advise your hired men to stay off this porch, I said calmly. Because the next step they take is a federal crime, and the people in that tree line have the authority to do something about it. Marcus laughed, sharp and mocking. Federal crime? You're inventing imaginary cops to save yourself, Eleanor. Grab her. The lead guard took one step onto the stairs. He didn't get a second one. The door behind me opened and a man in a tactical vest stamped U.S. Marshal stepped out beside me. The tree line came alive. A dozen agents emerged from the vines and the edge of the barn, rifles raised, 2 red laser sights settling directly on Holden's chest. The guards dropped their gear immediately and put their hands up. Marcus's face went the color of old paper. There's been a misunderstanding, he stammered. I'm a licensed attorney. This is a civil possession order. You're trespassing on federal ground, the marshal said flatly. I took another sip of coffee. Your possession order is invalid, Marcus. My grandmother never put this vineyard into the corporate trust. She placed it in a separate irrevocable trust, naming me sole beneficiary, transferred 48 hours before she died. You don't own a single square foot of this property. And as of 2 o'clock this morning, I'm a protected witness in a federal racketeering investigation. Holden shook his head violently. No, that's not possible. We need this house. It's true, the marshal confirmed. And by stepping onto this property to forcibly remove a protected witness, you've just committed a federal felony. Marcus's folder slipped out of his hand, the papers scattering across the wet gravel. My mother lunged toward the porch. Eleanor, please, this is a misunderstanding. We're family. There's nothing left to talk about, Mother, I said. Yesterday you told me to sacrifice my home to cover Holden's crimes. Today the federal government has something to say about that. More black vehicles rolled through the gate, IRS agents this time, carrying sealed cases. Marcus's color drained completely. You really thought a $40 million hole could disappear with a fake possession order? I asked, stepping down to the first stair. I spent last night reading 2 years of forensic accounting my grandmother had quietly commissioned on both of you. Every shell company. Every forged signature. Holden clutched his chest like he was having a heart attack. I have legal authority through the corporate bylaws. You have nothing, I said. Every account tied to your name and Marcus's has been frozen as of 6 a.m. under a federal asset seizure. Penelope shrieked, swiping at her banking app. Mom, my cards are declining. Do something. An IRS agent stepped forward and asked Penelope for the keys to her Range Rover, purchased with embezzled funds. Penelope had a full meltdown right there on the lawn. My mother grabbed her coat collar, her face draining of color. We'll lose the club, the house, everything. You're not losing your home, Mother, I said. You're finally living in the reality you tried to force on me. Then the door opened one more time and a tall man in a navy suit stepped out. The federal prosecutor I'd spoken to at 2 in the morning. Wire fraud and embezzlement carry heavy sentences, he said, his voice carrying across the driveway. But that's not the only reason we deployed agents to this property today. I stepped to the edge of the porch and looked directly at Marcus. I found the wire transfer, I said. $200,000 to the fire alarm contractor, dated 4 days before the fire. You didn't just steal from this family. You disabled the smoke detectors in my grandmother's house and let her burn to death so you wouldn't have to wait. Holden made a sound like he'd been gutted and collapsed onto the gravel. Penelope went completely silent. My mother's hands flew to her mouth. Holden Whitfield and Marcus Reyes, the prosecutor announced, pulling out warrants. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and racketeering. You'll be held without bail. They cuffed Marcus against his own SUV while he babbled about making a deal. Holden was dragged up off the gravel, screaming for our mother, who only backed away from him like he was something she didn't recognize anymore. I stood on the porch with my coffee, watching the cars take them away, the property finally silent except for the lake wind and the vines. My mother and Penelope were left stranded on the ruined lawn with no car and no money. My mother turned to me, instantly recalculating, her voice softening into something almost maternal. "Eleanor, my sweet girl," she started, stepping toward the stairs. "I had no idea, none of this is my fault. We're the only family you have left. Let us come inside." I let her get close enough to think it was working. "You're not a victim, Mother," I said. "You're an enabler who chose the illusion of wealth over your own daughter. Get off my porch. You can't leave us out here," she gasped. "We have no car, no phone. You have a 5-mile walk to the highway," I said. "I'd start now, those heels won't you after dark." I went inside and locked the door. Within minutes, the security panel chimed. My mother was pounding on the glass, her sympathy act gone, replaced by something colder. "Open this door, Eleanor. You're having a breakdown. I'm your mother and I'm getting you help whether you like it or not." I recognized the move instantly. She was laying groundwork for an involuntary psychiatric hold, a classic maneuver wealthy families use to legally strip someone of their autonomy. I'd found something else on that hard drive the night before, an audio file my grandmother's private investigators had recorded 3 weeks earlier. I connected my phone to the outdoor speaker system and played it for the whole property, including the agents still by the gate. My mother's voice, cold and calculating, filled the air. "Eleanor's isolated, she barely speaks to anyone. If we file for emergency conservatorship, can we have her committed?" A lawyer's voice answered. "With the right psychiatrist's signature, you'll have full medical power of attorney. You control every asset in her name." Then Penelope, chiming in, "Then we liquidate the vineyard and split it before anyone notices the money's gone." I stopped the recording. The silence on the porch was deafening. My mother's mask shattered completely. "You ungrateful little wretch," she screamed through the glass. "That money belongs to this family. Medical fraud and conspiracy to falsely imprison a competent adult is a federal crime, Mother," I said. "I already sent that file to the U.S. attorney. Enjoy your walk." I shut the door and didn't look back. 3 days later, I sat across from an auction specialist named Walter at the Pinnacle Club in San Francisco, finalizing the sale of a wine collection my grandmother had kept hidden in a climate-controlled bunker beneath the old barn. Bottles worth nearly $4 million that none of my family had ever known existed. I was halfway through the paperwork when the doors burst open, and my mother and Penelope stormed in, looking unhinged, trailing a nervous man in a cheap suit clutching a manila envelope. "Eleanor, sweetheart, this madness has to stop," my mother announced, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You need help." The man slapped the envelope down on the table. "You've been served," he said, then practically ran out the door. It was a petition for emergency conservatorship, signed by the same lawyer I'd captured on the recording. I didn't flinch. "Ignore them, Walter," I said, smoothing my sleeve. "Wealth has a way of producing theater when the funds run dry. You can't ignore a court order," my mother snapped. "You're a slow learner," I said. "That lawyer was arrested by the FBI this morning. He's currently telling federal investigators everything about your conservatorship scheme." 2 club security officers escorted my mother and sister out by the arms, screaming the whole way down the hall. I shook Walter's hand and finished the sale. I retained an estate attorney named Harriet Glenn, a woman with a reputation for surgical precision in a courtroom, and over the next 2 days I voluntarily underwent 3 independent psychiatric evaluations. All 3 came back unanimous. No signs of instability, exceptional cognitive function under stress. While reviewing my finances, Harriet discovered something else. 7 years earlier, the same week I'd received a small life insurance payout from my grandmother's late husband, someone had attempted an unauthorized wire transfer of the entire amount out of my account. I'd caught it, locked the account, and used the money to buy a derelict warehouse outside Petaluma, the same warehouse where I later found my grandmother's hidden wine collection. The destination account for that attempted theft, 7 years ago, traced directly back to my mother and Holden. Meanwhile, my mother turned her remaining venom on my younger sister, Dahlia, the quiet one who'd married a contractor named Theo and stayed out of the family's orbit entirely. My mother summoned Dahlia to her townhouse and demanded she sign a fraudulent affidavit, claiming I had a history of mental instability. Dahlia refused. Theo, who'd quietly endured years of my mother's condescension about his trade job, recorded the entire confrontation on his phone, including my mother threatening to blacklist his contracting business if Dahlia didn't comply. He sent it straight to me that night with a message. We're done with her. Use this. The conservatorship hearing took place 11 days after the fire. My mother showed up in a modest beige dress, performing humility for the judge, weeping about her unstable daughter. I sat in silence beside Harriet while she let my mother dig her own grave on the stand. When it was our turn, Harriet calmly submitted the psychiatric evaluations, then the banking records proving the warehouse purchase had been funded entirely by my own protected inheritance, not stolen corporate money as my mother's lawyer had claimed. Then she called Theo to the stand. His recording played for the entire courtroom, my mother's voice, demanding perjury, threatening extortion. The judge's expression went from sympathetic to furious in under a minute. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "you brought a fraudulent petition before this court to strip a competent woman of her civil rights in order to seize assets and fund your son's legal defense. This petition is dismissed with prejudice. I'm forwarding this case file to the district attorney's office for perjury and witness tampering charges, and ordering you to cover all of Ms. Whitfield's legal fees to be collected through seizure of your remaining assets." My mother collapsed in her chair. Her lawyer asked to withdraw from the case on the spot. Holden took a plea deal eventually, testifying against Marcus in exchange for a reduced sentence, though reduced still meant decades in a federal facility. Marcus got the maximum. Penelope disappeared to Arizona with a man she'd met at a bar 3 weeks after her credit cards stopped working, and I never heard from her again. A year later, I stood in the converted tasting room of what used to be that abandoned warehouse in Petaluma, now a private wine appraisal and authentication firm bearing my grandmother's name on the door. One of the rarest bottles from her collection sat under glass at the center of the room, a centerpiece instead of a relic. My face was on the cover of a regional business magazine that week, the headline calling me the appraiser who took down a hedge fund and built an empire out of the ashes. My head of security told me there were 2 people at the front gate asking for me without an appointment. On the security monitor, I almost didn't recognize them. My mother's hair had gone gray and unkempt. My father stood beside her in a wrinkled, second-hand coat, both of them looking like they'd aged 20 years and 12 months. After the court-ordered asset seizure, they'd lost the house, the cars, everything. Penelope had vanished. Holden was serving his sentence in a federal facility 1,000 miles away. I told my security team to let them to the gate, but no further. "Eleanor," my mother rasped, her voice hollow. "We walked 3 miles from the bus stop. We saw the article. We have nothing left, please. You have so much. Can't you show a little mercy to the people who gave you life?" I looked at the woman who had once told me to sacrifice my home to protect a murderer, and felt absolutely nothing, not anger, not pity, just quiet, total indifference. "Blood doesn't try to have you committed to steal what's yours," I said. "You made your choice. You're not my family. You're trespassing." I had security escort them off the property and watched the gate lock behind them, 2 small shapes shrinking down the road until they disappeared completely from my life. I walked back inside, past the bottle of 52 Bordeaux glowing under its glass case, into the private lounge where Dahlia and Theo were waiting with 2 glasses of champagne already poured. Theo's contracting business had tripled in size that year. Dahlia stood taller than I'd ever seen her. "To Grandma," I said, raising my glass. "To you," Dahlia said. "You saved all of us." I looked out over the place I'd built from nothing but my grandmother's secrets and my own stubbornness, and I understood something I hadn't fully understood the night I found that wire transfer receipt. The best revenge was never going to be watching them suffer. It was this, a life they could never touch again, built entirely without them, standing exactly where they swore I'd never belong.